And so to Brexit and the pandemic, I was thinking about this, and personally I think a mixture of the effect of the transition period and also the global pandemic that we're currently in the grips of has almost led us to forget that we have actually left the EU. But once again, we're approaching a major deadline, and political brinkmanship means that we're not sure what's going to happen in a few months' time. We do know the UK has ruled out asking for an extension to the transition period, so that will end on the 31st of December. And we know the economy is in much worse shape than it was this time last year. NISRA's labour force survey estimates were released just on Tuesday, 2 days ago, and indicated that the unemployment rate, 3.7%, had increased over the quarter of June to August 2020. The employment rate of 70.6 had also decreased over the quarter. Added to this, the furlough scheme is set to end at the close of October, and we know a wave of new lockdowns have just been introduced. So it's not a very cheery picture. But it's always so important to remember that when we're speaking about these things, we are speaking about people's actual lives. These aren't just statistics and political negotiations that exist in some ether. They have real impacts and consequences for real people. Probably don't need to remind the room of that, but I think it's always important just to say. So we're going to hear from 3 speakers today, each of whom is an expert in their area. And they're going to cover 3 very important topics: employment, immigration, and human rights. So thank you to each of our speakers for giving their time and expertise to be part of this conversation. I'm going to first welcome Esther Mcginnis from Ulster University. Dr. Esther is Senior Lecturer in Law and Director of Ulster Law Clinic. She's a former acting head of the Law School at Ulster and a founder and co-director of the Ulster University Law Clinic Social Justice Hub, and has over 20 years experience in employment law. As co-director of the multi-award-winning Ulster University Law Clinic, she supervises LLM access to justice students in providing pro bono services to claimants who might otherwise be unrepresented in areas of social security and also employment law. The clinic has offices in both Belfast and Derry. So without further ado, I will ask Esther to take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. And thanks everybody for joining us today. These bios always make you sound more than you are, I think. But anyway, I'm mindful of today's topic of this webinar, and it's my intention in the 10 minutes that I have to cover 3 areas and then take questions at the end. The first area I want to look at is COVID-19 and its impact on employment law and redundancies. The second is Brexit and what that might mean primarily for frontier workers. So Derry, Donegal, Newry, Armagh, is there an area of Northern Ireland really that isn't affected? And finally, given that this event is hosted by the Human Rights Consortium, I'm going to say a little bit about human rights and employment law with a focus on COVID-19 on the workplace. So for my first point then, many of you will know that the new job support scheme was announced by the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, on the 24th of September. And that means that 2/3 of salary from the 1st of November for those people who are affected by lockdown will be covered. Unfortunately, Helen mentioned there the NISRA statistics recently. In October, pre-pandemic, so October 2019, stats released by NISRA showed that Northern Ireland had the highest percentage rates of low-paid jobs in all of the UK, and that 1/5 of the jobs were classed as low pay. Unfortunately, it also showed that whilst the highest number of women ever were in work, the highest number were also in part-time employment. And I think that certainly bears out with what's happening now in terms of layoffs and redundancies. The people most affected by COVID-19, and certainly when schools were closed, were women and women in part-time jobs, and certainly low-paid workers. So it has hit them the hardest, as you might imagine, and it's difficult to identify with it's not difficult, sorry, to identify where the hardship will arise in the coming months. And as Helen mentioned earlier, this is going to become certainly more of a focus when furlough pay ends at the end of this month. And that is not to take away from the fact that employers, because of notice periods required for redundancy, have been making people redundant and consulting on redundancies since June of this year. But certainly as furlough comes to an end and notice periods are being worked, the increase in employment law is going to be stark. And I'm happy to pick up on that and questions later. In terms of Brexit, a recent report by the Confederation of British Industry found that 28% of employers had stopped any preparations for Brexit because of COVID-19 and the reactions to that. So the transition period ends, as you all know, on the 31st of December. And at that point, a new Australian-style point system will come into operation. However, my focus is on frontier workers. And we have been told, both by the British and Irish governments, that rights will remain the same. Nothing will change. Because, of course, the Common Travel Area was in existence prior to Ireland and the UK joining the EU. And that is the one issue, I believe, that we need to hang on to and that we need to argue for more comprehensively in the coming weeks and months. As you all know, the protocol on Ireland is outlined in the 2018 withdrawal agreement, and the provisions contained in that commit to continuation of the rights and entitlements in order to uphold the Common Travel Area. The Common Travel Area, of course, as you know, means that citizens can move freely between north and south, and at present, citizens north or south are not required to take any additional action. Post-Brexit Day, we hope that these rights will continue. At this point, we just don't know, but as I said, the Common Travel Area predated the EU and UK and Ireland membership of the EU, so we hang on to that. And at the minute, both governments are saying that no frontier worker permits will be required or relied upon for workers north or south. However, right now, what people are dealing with north and south is a request from employers to change their contracts of employment, to indicate that they're working from home, to indicate that they prefer to be paid either in sterling or euro, and they're being asked to change their contracts. The difficulty with that is, in the current climate, is if an individual is asked to change their contract of employment, they may find themselves in a situation where they open themselves up to redundancy because the contract of employment will change. Chances are it will not and cannot recognise previous employment history with that firm if the jurisdiction changes, and then they lose their rights, their current rights in Northern Ireland, to 2 years protection for redundancy. And that is the main issue at the minute the frontier workers are facing. And it's couched in language of working from home, paying you more fairly because you're paid in sterling or you're paid in euros to reflect the area where you live. And unfortunately, that is creating a lot of problems, and not just in terms of new contracts of employment, but also associated rights of employment protection, pension, and tax. And at the minute, most, but probably not all, cross-border workers are part of the double tax agreement system. So all those workers are entitled to, or workers are entitled to, rights north and south in terms of access to healthcare and social security and pension. But it is an issue that we are seeing an increasing amount of in the law clinic, where frontier workers are being asked to change their contracts of employment to reflect the jurisdiction that they're living in. And unfortunately, what's not being considered is their employment protection. And and in the current climate, as I say, protection from redundancy. I'm happy to pick up again on that in questions. In terms of human rights and employment and the current situation with COVID-19, there have been an increasing number of inquiries and cases on the impact of monitoring of employees at home. And that is extensive in that many firms have admitted to monitoring employee emails. And of course, your employer does have a right to do that. And that is, for the moment, settled law from the European Commission. However, there are other implications that arise from this. A number of employers are using platforms such as Hubstaff to determine keystrokes, to use employees' cameras to monitor their work. And of course, the difficulty with that is that in a home environment in particular, any monitoring that your employer does should not be covert, because that is absolutely illegal. It must be overt. It must be written in to their staff handbooks, to their notices. You must be aware of it. You must be aware of the impact. But in a working from home situation during the pandemic, that takes on a more nuanced criteria, because certainly when you're working in a workplace, in an office, and they're monitoring your work and your environment, that's a work environment. At home, that's completely different. And that raises lots of issues in terms of privacy. And research carried out by Cardiff and Sheffield universities recently indicated that 9 out of 10 people are happy to continue to work from home. And that followed on from research published by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development that said that surveillance by employers may damage trust. And 2 things to remember going forward is that a monitoring policy, particularly during this pandemic, may breach your Article 8 privacy rights, and it may also breach your employment contract on the basis of a breach of mutual trust and confidence. Also, one thing I'd say around that finally is that the GDPR requirements in terms of risk and in terms of health and monitoring are very, very clear. Any monitoring of employees, whether at work or working from home, must be in the public interest, and it must also be proportionate. And this is an issue that is going to run for some time. There's been some recent case law. In fact, very recently, there was a case taken by the Information Commissioner against H&M about a questionnaire that they sent to their staff that monitored their preferences on a number of grounds. And that was found to be potentially discriminatory and certainly a breach of their Article 8 rights. There are also issues that have come to light recently about, in terms of medical professionals, refusing to go into certain situations where they don't have proper PPE or full PPE. There was one disciplinary in April of this year that a health trust took against a consultant in a hospital in England. That case is liable to run for some time, excuse me, and will be instructive in terms of how we equip our health professionals in the coming months with proper PPE as we face into another 6 months of COVID and lockdown restrictions. I know that's a very brief run through. There is a lot there. I'm happy to take questions, excuse me, but I'm also happy to hand over to Helen.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you. There's so much there in terms of particular groups who are vulnerable. I thought your focus on not only women, but also those border workers was just fantastic. And I know we have Anne-Marie here from border people as well, so she might have some comments or questions as well. I am next going to introduce our second speaker, who is Una Boyd. Una Boyd is the Immigration Project Coordinator at the Committee on the Administration of Justice, which is an independent human rights organisation based in Northern Ireland. Una is an experienced immigration solicitor and is chair of the Law Society of Northern Ireland's Immigration Practitioners Group. So Una, if you're happy enough then to unmute yourself and start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on to speak today. So I've been asked to cover the topic of immigration, and obviously that's something that the immigration legislation, immigration rules and their impact, I think, received quite a lot of attention, particularly sort of towards the start of the pandemic. And I'm going to try and look at that, and then what lessons we can take as we face into Brexit in a couple of months. And I'm going to really try not to leave everyone despairing, so keep it relatively positive. So yeah, just to begin, and to be quite blunt, as most people in this meeting today know, the immigration regime in the UK is characterised by racism, inequality and human rights abuses. And, you know, despite scandals like Windrush, the current government has shown no inclination to address that or to change. And in fact, at the minute, they're talking about, you know, putting asylum seekers on islands. So they're actually going very far in the opposite direction. And when coronavirus struck, what we saw was that the sort of existing inequalities that are an intentional design of the immigration regime, and they left so many people in extremely vulnerable and just inhumane conditions. There was people unable to access healthcare, people left in precarious work conditions, people stuck in crowded detention centres, people unable to access support if they lost their job. I think at the time there was one commentator who responded to sort of a government line about, oh, you know, we're all in the same boat. And they said, well, yeah, we're all in boats, but mine has a big hole in it and no oars. So I thought that was a pretty good way of looking at it. I think that the inequalities were just so extreme, and that was why they received, I suppose for the first time, we actually did get quite a big focus on them. You know, I think the one that always sticks out to me is in the middle of a pandemic, we had people who were afraid to access healthcare because the Home Office collects data about migrants from the NHS. So there were people in the UK who were more afraid of deportation than the virus, and there were charities and organisations, particularly in England, who were able to show cases where people had actually died from coronavirus because they were scared to access healthcare. We also had the situation which received a lot of attention, which is that people who had been living here for years and paying taxes weren't able to access even basic support if they lost their job due to the pandemic, because their visa has one little line on it that says no recourse to public funds. We also just had situations like asylum seekers being told, well, you need to socially distance, you need to self-isolate, but also they're in accommodation which is overcrowded, living with strangers, communal areas, and there's a real sort of the government was very slow to actually assist people in those situations if they did at all. I could go through a list of examples, but I think it was that the pandemic, these things were so quite extreme, and it really exposed and highlighted the inequalities that are part of the UK immigration regime. And that's something that I want to kind of emphasize, that these things weren't mistakes and they weren't oversights. These are intentional design. They're a design feature of the UK immigration regime. The hostile environment is UK government policy. It's legislated for in Immigration Acts 2014, 2016 particularly. It's very much on purpose, and its entire design is to make life as difficult as possible for people who are deemed not to be legally living in the UK. It moves immigration controls into normal life, into day-to-day situations. So it turns ordinary people into immigration officers, and it's things like accessing a doctor, getting a bank account, getting a driving license, taking out a lease on a house. All of those things become subject to checks, and the checks are carried out by your landlord, by the person working in the bank, by a person in the hospital. And we can also see it reflected in policies like immigration detention, eye-wateringly expensive visa fees, no recourse to public funds. On the face of it, this is all designed to limit immigration and to encourage people who aren't living in the UK legally to leave. But the reality is that it impacts the entire migrant community. And in fact, it also impacts anyone who doesn't meet sort of a cliche description of what a British person looks and sounds like. So it's really the hostile environment. It creates a culture of discrimination, and the horrific impact that it can have. It was most famously demonstrated in the Windrush scandal. And the Windrush Lessons Review, they actually stated the scandal was not an accident, but a result of planned policies, and the Home Office has a culture of disregard for human rights and humanity. On top of all this, there's actually no evidence that the hostile environment works or that it in any way limits illegal immigration. What there is evidence of is that it does cause racism, discrimination, and that it breaches human rights law. So coronavirus increased and exposed these inequalities, but it is really important, and I think Helen already touched on this, to remember that they already existed, that they were planned, and they're still in place now. So now we're facing into Brexit. From the 31st of December this year, we're looking at the biggest overhaul of the UK's immigration system in decades. And instead of hostile environment policies, instead of these policies that have been proven to be discriminatory, to breach human rights law, instead of them being reduced or rolled back on, we're instead going to see them opened up to an even broader range of people, and that's EU nationals. So after the 31st of December, EU nationals arriving in the UK will be subject to just UK immigration law, including hostile environment policies, for the first time ever. And even people, EU citizens who are already resident in the UK, who can apply to the settlement scheme, are at risk of falling into hostile environment policies. So far, the Home Office has refused to actually confirm that they won't subject EU nationals resident in the UK before December 2020 to hostile environment policies. The example used was, what if somebody can't apply on time? What if somebody just can't access the web? It's going to be an online document. What if the website falls and people can't prove their status? I think it speaks volumes that the Home Office won't come out with a clear statement to say they're not going to subject those EU citizens to the hostile environment. In Northern Ireland, the new immigration regime is going to have really specific impacts, which unfortunately I just don't think we're prepared for. And we've already seen examples of this. The D'Souza case was a really good example where there was such a specific, unique impact in Northern Ireland, and that had to be fought out in court. It required a serious policy rework by the Home Office. It's probably just one positive example of a win, but there are other things coming through, such as the Frontier Workers Permit Scheme. The Home Office are talking about electronic travel authorisation to enter the UK, which makes no sense in the border regions. We have this, as Esther touched on, this real emphasis on the common travel area. It's fine, no action needed, your rights are protected, but the government point blank refuses to provide any information on what those rights are, where people can find them, and how they're protected. And they've failed to engage with the fact that the common travel area already doesn't work for many of our migrant community, that some people have described it as there's already a hard border for some of our community, and that should be modernised and expanded instead of being restricted, which is what we're going to see after Brexit. And I think one common thread, and I know some of the people in this meeting today will very much be able to back me up on this, is that when it comes to immigration, there's this rapid increase in policy making and legislation, and what we constantly see is just the complete failure or unwillingness, depending on how kind you're going to be about it, to engage with the impacts on Northern Ireland, and to look at sort of the needs here, the unique sort of setup, and to think about that when they're developing immigration policy. And I think even the idea of travel authorisation to enter the UK, there's no mention of the border areas here. And that would have people who, say, for example, want to go do their shopping across the border, who can currently do that freely. That would expect them to apply for travel authorization, kind of like you do currently when you travel to America. So yeah, I would be really concerned that a lot of the impacts in Northern Ireland haven't been engaged with. There's been little to none public consultation, little to no public consultation. And I think when it comes to things like impact assessments, they're launching a frontier worker scheme. They don't know how many frontier workers there are. But I suppose the biggest impact that I think we're going to see in terms of immigration and Brexit in Northern Ireland just brings us straight back to the hostile environment. And that's a really simple thing, where Northern Ireland is going to have the only land border with the EU in the UK. All of the negotiations, all of the talk around that has been very clear that they do not want to return to a hard border. There will not be checks on the border. But at the same time, you have the UK government bringing about a much stricter and harsher immigration regime. And how do those two things match up? And I think that our concern is what we're going to see is Northern Ireland itself just becoming one big border. And that you would see these hostile environment policies, these in-country checks, just massively increased here. And considering the impact we've already seen during coronavirus, it's really concerning that these policies will be increased rather than rolled back on. And to try and be positive, what I would say is that it hasn't happened yet. And I think it's something that we simply, as a society, we don't have to accept. Northern Ireland is unique in the UK. You know, it's a post-conflict society. We have the promise of the peace process, which was a rights-based society. And while migrant rights mightn't have been top of the agenda when they were drafting the Good Friday Agreement, I think it's clear that any promise of a rights-based society has to be for everyone in that society and for all the people in Northern Ireland. So when you have laws like these that have been proven to undermine equality and to breach human rights law, they can't fit into a rights-based society. And I think we, in Northern Ireland, we should be challenging these policies on that basis. And that is difficult because immigration is not devolved, but so many things that are linked to and impacted by the hostile environment are. And so some of those are so very clear from the coronavirus pandemic. So things like healthcare, housing, justice, social security. We saw during the pandemic, for example, our health minister made a declaration that they would not be sharing the data of any migrant person who accessed healthcare due to coronavirus with the Home Office. And he made that statement quite clearly. I think we were maybe the only part of the UK where the health department made that statement publicly. And obviously that was hugely important then for the migrant community to know that they could safely access healthcare without risking their information being passed on to the Home Office and potential immigration enforcement. And I think really what we want to see is more of that, and our politicians taking strong stances against hostile environment policies where they link and where they impact devolved powers. So yeah, hopefully to try and end on a positive note, that lessons can be learned from that will help us brace ourselves for Brexit, I suppose. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Una. And I did ask each of the speakers if they could include anything positive, then please do so, because this can be so oppressive, I guess. So thank you so much for doing that, and for the very chilling whistle-stop tour. Particularly, I find the idea of Northern Ireland becoming one big border, and that idea that's already happened over the past few years of immigration checks happening throughout our society, like you were saying, in terms of housing, and the idea of like teachers and people like that having to become immigration officers essentially is just not a very nice view of where our society might be headed. So I am going to introduce our last speaker today, who is my colleague at the Human Rights Consortium. Dr. Jacqueline Monaghan has a PhD in Transitional Justice from Ulster University, an MSc in Development Studies from the Centre for Sustainable Development at UCD, and a BA in Anthropology from CSU. Jacqueline has 25 years experience working in human rights and community development for numerous intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations in Latin America, the Balkans and in Ireland. And Jacqueline is going to talk to us about human rights. So thank you so much, and it's yours. Sorry, Jacqueline, you're still on mute.
There we go. Well, to say that when Helen asked me to try to frame things around Brexit in a positive way, I did really struggle with that. And maybe particularly now as we seem to go into tighter COVID restrictions, it's even more challenging, but we'll see where we get to at the end. So for me, the discussion around Brexit begins with the Good Friday Agreement, and which, as you know, brought peace to Ireland, Northern Ireland in 1998, and is a legally binding bilateral treaty. And in it, the UK government made a commitment to incorporate the European Convention on Human Rights into law, which it did through creating the Human Rights Act, and it committed to creating a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, which it has not yet done. And so after 20 years, here we are, and many people would argue that the UK commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act is questionable. And it's a clear fact that the Bill of Rights still hasn't been produced. And so I won't go into the details about all that's been lost as a result of leaving the EU in terms of human rights, but it's been fairly significant. And the EU was very much like the glue of the human rights and equality framework within Northern Ireland. And so here we come to 2020, and we've got this as I think the title of maybe of this webinar is called, it was this perfect storm. And you know, so after 3 years of the executive and the Northern Ireland Assembly not working, they resumed in January, and it is pretty clear to most everyone that it's been very difficult for the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister to agree on very much. The UK left the EU when we entered into this 1-year transition period, which is basically a countdown until the end of the year, when all the legislation, all the policies, all the procedures that are needed to fill the gaps, or actually the gaping hole that was left by leaving the EU, need to be in place. And then COVID arrived. And so where did this leave, you know, our already vulnerable post-conflict society? I mean, I think we all know that people are struggling, they're coping, they're surviving physically, emotionally, financially, and politicians and individuals are all grappling with trying to balance physical health, mental health, their livelihoods, and home teaching, if that, we go back to that even. And in the first half of the year, when we were all faced with the very scary unknowns of COVID, you know, Brexit kind of took a back seat from everyone's mind. And when all things kind of COVID kind of seemed to settle down a bit, at the end of the summer, Brexit kind of came back at an accelerated pace. But the reality is Brexit never left. We did leave the EU, and there's always been people working away on the details and the negotiations. And I think people dealing with all of that are pretty overwhelmed, particularly now as the deadline draws near, and then also with COVID. And what we've seen in recent weeks, in the past couple of months, we've seen the British government pushing through legislation in terms of a recent an internal markets bill, the fisheries bill, the agricultural bill, and also negotiating trade deals that are not only contrary to environmental and human rights commitments that were made in the Good Friday Agreement or the withdrawal agreement with the EU, but also oppose the Conservative Party's own manifesto promise to raise standards in areas like workers' rights, animal welfare, agriculture, the environment. And in reality, the draft legislation shows a vision of a future, including foreign policy and domestic affairs, viewed by the government through a lens of growth and trade, without looking at the long-term impact or a holistic approach, or having any ethical or rights dimension to it. And I think it's clear, and it has become clearer since the Brexit process began, that the EU was the driver for human rights and equality standards in Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is an aspect of the EU and UK withdrawal agreement, permits Northern Ireland to kind of progress along with the EU in terms of equality, regardless of what the rest of the UK does. The Northern Ireland Protocol also commits the UK to not reducing or lowering the non-diminution of rights, but it's just to not reduce the rights that are set out in the Good Friday Agreement as a result of the UK leaving the EU. And so to talk about for a minute about this draft legislation that was recently presented, this internal markets bill that was presented to Parliament a number of weeks ago, it's meant to facilitate trade between the 4 nations within the UK after leaving the EU. And it's raised a number of questions about if and how the UK plans to uphold the commitments it made to implementing the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And it's particularly worrisome on a number of levels because it raises the question of whether if the UK government is willing to renege on some aspects of the withdrawal agreement with the EU and then potentially break international law through it, how do we know it will stand over the other commitments that it's made? And therefore, are the rights of Northern Irish people or people within Northern Ireland in jeopardy? I mean, will the government stand by the commitments made in the protocol? So the answer to this simply remains to be seen. I mean, nobody knows, and it's all about speculation. But it seems to me that whether or not we have the EU to push forward a rights agenda in Northern Ireland, we're almost back where we started with the Good Friday Agreement. And that perhaps the answer lies in what was promised then, which was a strong and inclusive Bill of Rights, which would act as an overarching framework for steering decisions and political negotiations for the future for Northern Ireland. A Bill of Rights would foster confidence and trust in the government, which clearly is an issue and is a huge worry. But a Bill of Rights, again, would also strengthen our human rights framework, which has been essential for peace here. So, as I said at the beginning, just trying to think about how to frame things in a positive way and finding that very challenging. I suppose a bit of it is about outlook. And earlier at the AGM for the Human Rights Consortium this week, we had Claire Rice from Newcastle University, and she made the good point that at the very least, the EU and Ireland and the USA have all expressed support for Northern Ireland and that they would endeavour to do what they can to push the UK to uphold the rights commitments or the rights committed to in the Good Friday Agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so in some sense that, that is definitely a positive point. And then there's always the thought that, through every crisis and conflict doesn't have to always be negative, and it can bring about positive change. And so perhaps we can use this, this crisis around COVID and around Brexit to be the turning point that people will finally genuinely see the benefit of having a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland and will, support a campaign to create one. So that's really it.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And I think you did a really great job there of trying to frame it positively. And for me, as Claire McCann knows, throughout this whole Brexit process, I have just felt that the unknown is one of the cruelest things about it. People not being able to plan, people not being able to think about the future. I know that the Northern Ireland Royal Women's Network did an excellent report just based off views of their members. They weren't even specifically asking about Brexit, but just about the disruption to people's lives, particularly in the border areas that this has caused. I don't have any questions in the chat box. If anybody would like to ask a question, if they want to indicate. Because if not, oh, Jacqueline, do you have a question?
hang on. I actually do have a question. I have a question for Una. And I just wanted to know, maybe this isn't fair to ask, but I was wondering if you think, or if you're in your experience, do you think that the policies and practices around immigration in the UK are better or worse or comparable to that of the Republic?
It's actually really, I know this sounds like what people say as they're trying to think of an answer, but it's a very interesting question. I will be honest, I'm not Jill qualified. I've never practiced immigration on the South, so my knowledge of it is pretty low. But I do know solicitors who, some, for example, are based in border areas, and they tend to be dual qualified. And my understanding is that generally the immigration regime in the South is fairer to a certain extent and more accessible. Now, there's huge issues obviously with things like direct provision, but in terms of sort of family visas, obviously it's staying in the EU, so EU migration is so much broader, so much more accessible. Just as an example, if you're an EU national currently until December, if you want to come to the UK with your family, with non-EU family, as long as you can show that you're working or studying or just exercising your treaty rights in another European country, your non-EU family member can join you. It's free. You don't have to prove you're earning a certain amount of money. You don't have to. It's just so much more accessible for people, and that's going to be one of the huge losses, I think, post Brexit. I've also heard about people have pointed this out, of the contrast in the immigration regimes, because you're going to have, I think the South, for example, are moving to regularize, can't say that word apparently, regularize undocumented people in the South, whereas what you have in the UK is pretty much the exact opposite, where they're, the hostile environment policies are there to make life as difficult as possible for people who don't have the right sort of documents or status. I think what we will see, and we've heard businesses say, is that they are losing huge amounts of employees to the South, because particularly if you're an EU national, why would you wait about when you don't know what's going to happen, when you've been very clearly told the entire message of Brexit is that you're not welcome, you're not going to be, they won't even confirm that they're not going to subject you to hostile environment policies. People can move half an hour down the road and still be living in the EU, know what their rights are, know what the future holds. And that's something that, again, when we talk about the UK government failing to ever really think about Northern Ireland when they implement a lot of policies, that's only happening here. And yeah, not sure if I answered the question, but
no, thank you.
We have a question here. I see Anne-Marie is indicating, but Liz Griffith has one which Anne-Marie actually might want to jump in on too. So Liz is asking, can any speakers tell us more about the issues affecting frontier workers and where they sit within the EU settlement scheme? Thank you.
I think Anne-Marie should definitely come in on this. Sorry, Anne-Marie, but just to briefly say, so a frontier worker who doesn't reside in Northern Ireland can't apply to the settlement scheme. Just, you have to be resident in the UK. So what they have done, and it's only been published, I think it was 2 weeks ago nearly, there's draft legislation for a frontier workers permit, that anyone who's a frontier worker or a cross-border worker is going to have to apply to. It's only draft. It looks like basically it'll be coming in before the end of December. People will have to make the application between December and end of June next year. So it's this really short window, and it's very similar to the settlement scheme in that it's going to be free and it's an online application. But yeah, it's I'll maybe ask Anne-Marie maybe to touch on sort of, there's a lot of issues with it and I don't know where to start.
Can you hear me okay? Is my microphone on? I suppose, yeah, just to follow on from Una, the Frontier Worker Scheme, we've only just come across it a couple of weeks ago. We've been asking a lot about it. We don't know of a scheme that will set up in the South, but certainly the UK one we're keeping a close eye on. Very much because, yes, the Common Travel Area is there and it's brilliant to have it, no doubt about it. It just doesn't have the legal footing of the withdrawal agreement and all the EU legislation behind that. So that worries us a little bit. Even the Memorandum of Understanding says it's nothing intended to create legal obligations. So that's a worry for frontier workers. So we've been pushing all along. I'm trying to create some comfort in the fact that the withdrawal agreement is there, and that frontier workers got a mention, got its own little paragraph, and we were keeping an eye on these schemes that were being released. But now that we've had a look at the legislation, the thing that jumps out at me is that it's available to people who were living in the south and working in the north, or it will be available. It's draft legislation, as Una mentioned, a statutory instrument which could zoom through without much tweaking. And we are, I suppose, concerned that, yes, it's going to capture EU 26, but it's applicants from Ireland, Irish, are encouraged not to bother, to rely on the common travel area instead. And British citizens who are now living in the south and working in the north can't apply because they're not eligible at the moment. It's EEA citizens who are not also British citizens. So that's a real worry for us, because of course we know through Emma D'Souza's case and Jake's that everyone born in the north, more or less, is actually a British citizen first. So there'll be many of those who identify as Irish, for example, or even British. Both of them, they'll be on the other side of the border and won't be entitled to apply. But I have heard people mention for the other EEA citizens that it could be a route for people who don't maybe qualify under the EU settlement scheme to have their family members with them, that there could be some connection there through an ongoing frontier workers scheme. I don't fully understand where they're coming from on this now, to be honest, because it suggests that there's still residents in the south. So I'm not 100% sure about what it means, but I suppose a frontier worker can be across the border for long periods of time. They're not obliged to go home every day. A frontier worker goes home once a week. A cross-border worker can go home even less than that. So it might have entitlements there for their family members to be with them while they are at their place of work. So there's something in there that I don't know about anything about, but maybe you keep an eye on that. So it could be a route for people who wouldn't qualify under the EU settlement scheme, but they would qualify under a frontier worker scheme. So there's entitlements in there linked with family, but as I say, I don't know any more. I've run out now. That's all I know.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and particularly appreciate it that you came to take part in this to observe and got called on. So thank you so much. I see there's a question here and comment from Claire. Claire McCann, do you want to unmute and ask it yourself, or do you want me to read it out?
No, I can unmute. Hang on a second. I'll put on my camera as well, so I'm not sitting in the dark.
Thank you so much.
No, I was just saying in the comments that it was really good, chilling outlook in some respects, obviously, in terms of the rights framework going forward. I mean, I think, Una, yours in particular in relation to the immigration procedures is it's a bit worrying, because there's so many unknowns about how things are going to work, and so I think that's very problematic. But since you're looking for positives, Helen, I said one positive is that the UK government has committed to supporting the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and the Equality Commission of Northern Ireland to oversee the non-diminution commitment in the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that is something that obviously is a piece of work that's going to be ongoing and getting up and running. So we don't really know where that's going to go yet, but it's at an early stage, and that's a positive. Question that I have is for Esther, but maybe other people would have some views on it. I was just wondering about the kind of ongoing EU commitments, given that we're still in the transition period and people are being asked to change contracts and things, whether or not the transfer of undertakings, the TUPE directive or regulations, whatever it is, would have any impact on people who are being forced to change regulation or change contracts, and whether that will change then kind of going forward post transition. It's something I know very little about, so I'm just literally asking to see just for any information that you might have. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Okay, so TUPE is, so the Transfer of Undertaking and Protection Employees legislation is just that. It is very much pro-employee legislation. I think that's the first thing to say. And for that reason, it's very important. At the minute, I think post-Brexit, employers would love to change TUPE. They've never liked it. They've never liked any of the changes that have been introduced, and they're very keen to be rid of it completely. And that's aside from a Brexit issue, but also Brexit focuses that, I think. And look, I think that there are no plans at the minute to change. We are told that there are no plans at the minute to change any rules around TUPE. And that's because, you know, to be quite honest, when you have an increase in employers recommending to employees that they should change their contracts because of COVID, there's a more nuanced way, perhaps is a polite way to address this. There's a more nuanced way to streamline your employment workforce than using TUPE, which would be quite a crude tool at any time, but particularly now during COVID. So I think that there are no, just to be clear, there are no plans to change TUPE. I think what government have said is that they may harmonise some terms and conditions to make them slightly more business friendly. That is literally all they've said. So it is a case of watch this space. But at the minute, there are no plans to change it. But I am more concerned with the fact that frontier workers in particular are being asked to change their contract to indicate that they're working from home. And I think the implications for that have on workers is more detrimental and more dangerous than any changes that might come through TUPE down the line.
Thank you so much. And we are probably going to end it there because, as I say, we like to wrap up within the hour. Can I just say thank you so much to each of our three speakers. You're fantastic. Special shout out to Anne-Marie as well, who became one of our speakers without her knowing that was going to happen. I think, and thank you everybody for attending. I think one of the things is all the work that's being done. The fact that we have saved what we have saved going forward is because of all the work that all these groups have been doing, and that work just needs to continue. And indeed, overarching human rights structure moving forward in a Bill of Rights. But we will send out the questionnaire then, probably on Tuesday, and I just hope everybody has a lovely weekend. And if you're at a loose end, Northern Ireland Rural Women's Network have a full programme today for International Rural Women's Day, and including a talk later with WRDA based on that feminist recovery plan. So thank you all so much for attending, and maybe we'll see you at our next COVID conversations.
Thank you.